All right. Welcome to Guide to the Old Testament, week 5. This week we are focused on reading Exodus. So we have a few small group questions here based on your homework. And we can get started with our fill in the blank notes here. So today we're studying the book of Exodus, as I just said. And as we've been reviewing over our weeks, the theme of Exodus is from slavery to Sinai. So from slavery to Sinai is our theme. Again, today we'll do the facts, the shape, and the reward. So the facts, we're still in the Pentateuch, so we're going to be written by Moses, is our author for the book. And another key fact about this book is it records the main salvation event of the Old Testament. And what I mean by that is, just like the New Testament is kind of an explanation and exploration of the salvation that Jesus accomplished in his life and on the cross, the Old Testament kind of relates to the Exodus in that way. It's an explanation and a working out of what it means that God rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt and brought them to himself in a covenant relationship. So let's take a look next at the shape of this book. We've got 2 boxes here that are identical, and we're going to kind of look at 4 scenes from the 2 major movements of this book. So the first part of the book we're going to call From Slavery. And you can guess that the second part then is going to be called To Sinai. And we're not going to cover every single story that's in this book, but we're going to hit 4 really important ones that come out here. So first, and this is the book where Moses enters the story and becomes really kind of the main character other than God himself. And so the book of Exodus opens with this birth story for Moses, where Pharaoh is oppressing the people of God. They're slaves in Egypt, and they're supposed to throw all of the male children of the Israelites into the Nile River. So Moses' parents have to hide him for, I believe, 3 months. And then they do, in a way, throw him into the Nile River. So this is baby Moses right here. But they throw him into the Nile River in a basket so that he floats down the river. And the word used for basket here is very unusual because it's the same word used for Noah's Ark. So it's almost like Moses is doing a little reenactment here of the story of Noah being saved through the waters of death in an ark. And so God rescues Moses, and he's taken by Pharaoh's daughter out of the Nile and eventually goes to live in Pharaoh's house. He grows up there until he has to go into exile in Midian because he committed murder. He killed an Egyptian slave master. And that takes us to the next part of the story, Moses' calling. So we'll make this story go from chapter 3 to about, we'll say, chapter 6. All right? Now, the beginning of this in chapter 3, chapter 4, is that famous story of the burning bush. So this is a bush right here. The bush has green leaves because it's not being burned up. But at the same time, it is going to be on fire. So let's get us some red here, maybe some orange over here. So God reveals himself to Moses in this burning bush, and he tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and to say to Pharaoh to let God's people go. So they can go up to the good land, the promised land. And Moses has some objections for him. And we're not going to look at all these objections, but some of them are really important. So look with me here. Let's go to verse 11 of chapter 3. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" So Moses doesn't think he's the kind of guy who can really pull off this rescue mission. So he said, "But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." So Moses might not have what it takes to bring the people out of Egypt, but God's going to be with him. And then Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?'" That is, what is his reputation? What kind of power, what kind of deeds does he have that he's going to do any good for us? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." Famous phrase right there, of course. And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, that is Yahweh, is the word that's translated Lord right there. God's personal name that's built on this verb to be that we've seen. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And so the people have asked, what is God's name? And God's response is essentially, I am who I am. I am not dependent on anyone. I exist by myself. I'm not restricted or limited by anyone. And so I can be whatever I want to be toward you. And I've chosen to be with you. And so he has this name, Yahweh, the Lord, that looks very much like it means he is. And so that leads us to a very key theme in the book of Exodus. And if you read through this book, you won't be able to miss it. But over and over again, the things that God does are so that the people will know that he is Yahweh. So that Pharaoh will know that he is Yahweh. So that Israel will know that he is Yahweh. So that the nations will know that he is Yahweh. He's making for himself a name in the book of Exodus. Let's write this one here. I am who I am. So Moses is calling in this beginning of God revealing himself. Next is the most famous story, most likely from the book of Exodus, the 10 plagues. So in order to convince Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go, in order to defeat the gods of Egypt, God sends Moses to do these various plagues, like turning the water of the river Nile into blood. Or in another plague, there's frogs all over the land of Egypt. This is a frog right here, if you can't tell. Happy frog. And of course, the last plague is where every firstborn son in the land of Egypt dies, except for those that have the blood of a lamb on their doorframe. Right? This is called the Passover, and it's the moment that's celebrated in the Passover festival every year by Israel. The sheep's happy because he doesn't know he's about to get eaten. And so then Pharaoh does let the people of Israel go, even though his heart was hard. The plagues last from about chapter 7 to chapter 13. And the story that we get next is another famous one. They're all famous in the book of Exodus. The crossing of the Red Sea. So after Israel leaves Egypt, Pharaoh decides, maybe that wasn't the best idea. I'm going to chase them down. And Israel's kind of stuck up against the Red Sea, or as it's called in Hebrew, the Sea of Reeds. Right? We can draw a little fish here. And so what happens is God divides the waters, and he makes a path appear between them, allows Israel to go through on dry ground, and those waters cover over the Egyptian army that's chasing them. And that's kind of almost a recreation, or a reenactment, I should say, of the creation story and the flood story, where God parts the waters to make dry ground appear, whereas these waters of chaos and uncreation cover over the Egyptians. Okay, so that story there is chapters 14 and 15. And chapter 15 is actually a poem that reflects on this story of the Red Sea that ends up being very foundational for how Israel thinks about their God Yahweh and how he shows up to save them. So it appears it's quoted in a lot of Psalms and different places in the Old Testament, that poem in chapter 15. But now we come to the second portion of our book, beginning in chapter 16, to Sinai. So chapter 16 through 18 is in the wilderness on the way to Mount Sinai. And on the way, the people are whining. So they're whining about things like they're really hungry. And back in Egypt, they had such good food. Like they've already forgotten that they were like slaves back there. And so God has to send them bread from heaven called manna that they're eating in the wilderness. He also, for example, has Moses open up a rock so that water flows out of it for the people to drink. So God's supplying their needs in the wilderness, whereas Israel's kind of struggling to really trust in God out here in the wilderness. Now, in chapter 19, we do finally arrive at Mount Sinai, and we get another major moment in the story where God's going to make a covenant with his people. Let's look at a little text from this portion right here. Let's go to Exodus chapter 19. Get my keyboard out here. Exodus chapter 19. Good. So here they've arrived at Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up to God here in verse 3. So it says, "The Lord called him out of the mountain, saying, 'Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel.'" And so, as God is seeking to fulfill those promises he made to Abraham all the way back in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, here what he's doing is calling the people of Israel to join with him in doing that. So they're going to be a treasured possession who belongs to God, but they're also going to be a kingdom of priests who spread the presence and the blessing of God to all the peoples of the earth, for all the earth belongs to God. Just like that promise to Abraham said that all the families of the earth would be blessed in Abraham and in his descendants. This is now what's going to happen as long as the people of Israel will obey God's voice and keep his covenant. And so in line with that, God appears to the people on Mount Sinai, and here in chapter 20, he starts to tell them what are some of the basic terms of the covenant that they need to keep, right? The 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. Don't make for yourself a carved image, and so on. So we can draw some pictures here of the covenant. So we're at Mount Sinai, and God appears in a cloud. His presence is there. There's lightning. There's fire on the mountain. This, by the way, is the same mountain where the burning bush story happened. And then we get the tablets of the 10 Commandments here. Okay. And in chapter 24, they seal the covenant and agree to the covenant. Moses splatters the blood of a sacrifice on them, and it's official. They're in a covenant with God. Now, the next thing that happens is in chapters, it's 25 through 31. And then he comes back to it in chapters 35 through 40. And this is the instructions that God gives for building this tent, the tabernacle. And the way to think of the tabernacle, that's a really lopsided tent, sorry. The way to think of the tabernacle, it's basically a portable version of Mount Sinai. So just like there was the cloud that represents God's presence on Mount Sinai, the same thing is true here of the tabernacle. And so there's an altar in front of it. And we kind of talked about this a little bit when we did an overview of the whole Pentateuch. But the idea is now is that people, even as they're wandering around in the wilderness, it's as if they have Mount Sinai, or even as if they have the Garden of Eden right there with them as they go. God's presence is with them, blessing them, helping them to prosper, fighting for them. And that's why we see a lot of imagery in terms of the building of this tabernacle in these long chapters that can be a little monotonous. If you're paying attention, you're getting all kinds of reminders of the Garden of Eden. So an example from your homework was that on top of the Ark of the Covenant, there are 2 cherubim. Cherubim, right? And the last time we heard anything about cherubim was that those are the guards to the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve were cast out of it. So it's very much like the Israelites are now moving around the wilderness as in the Garden of Eden, in God's presence, being blessed by him. This is a huge deal. God is going to go with them and take them to the promised land. But in chapters 32 through 34, there's a big problem, which is that the people of Israel commit treachery. While Moses is up on the mountain, he's taking too long, and so they decide, well, we're going to have to take care of things on our own. Let's make for ourselves a golden calf. Now, I'm no better at drawing calves than I am at drawing sheep, but we're going to do our best here. Here, we'll put some spots on it, and we'll make the calf say moo, and now it's a calf. They make a golden calf, and they worship this calf. It becomes an idol to them at the base of the mountain. So the first of those 10 commandments, that they shall have no other gods before Yahweh the Lord, they're already breaking it, even as Moses is still up on the mountain hearing about this tabernacle where God is going to dwell with them. And it creates this crisis in terms of making the covenant. Is God going to still be the God of this people when they've turned their back on him and broken the covenant? Okay, that's the question. And we can find out the answer too. So in chapters 32 then through 34, that's kind of the crisis that the book is dealing with. Let's look then at, we'll look at chapter 34 and see some of how this gets resolved. Oops. Let's do Exodus 34. Here we go. And so in the process of Moses appealing to God to continue to go with them and to be their God, Moses asks if he can see God's glory. And surprisingly, the Lord basically says yes. And so here in chapter 34, verse 5, the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and he proclaimed the name of Yahweh. So this whole book has been about finding out who Yahweh is. And now here in the peak point of crisis, when God's people have rebelled against him, we're about to find out the ultimate expression of what it means. So the Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. And so here we have a revelation of a God who's merciful, who's gracious, who even keeps his steadfast love in his covenant and forgives his people's sin. That's not to say he clears the guilty, right? The guilty parties will be punished, and there is punishment for the golden calf. But he has an opportunity for forgiveness, and he remains faithful to the people of Israel. He does not send them into the promised land without his presence. And now this Exodus 34, 6 and 7, where God gives this full explanation of what his name, Yahweh, he who is, what it represents about his character, it becomes really a foundational text for the rest of the Old Testament. So if you're in class, we'll be doing this activity over here to look up each of these passages that actually quote from Exodus 34, 6 through 7, and make use of that confession about God's character in different ways. If you're watching from home, you're welcome to go look at some of these on your own. It's a really interesting study to see how the Old Testament itself is quoting from and using Exodus 34, 6 and 7, almost like a creed or a foundational statement of who God is. And this really takes us straight to the reward, the incentive that we have for reading the book of Exodus, which is that as we read it, we're going to see the God of salvation and the God of judgment, which is one God. The God who's gracious, merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, but who will by no means clear the guilty. And so really a central purpose of the book of Exodus is to allow the God of Israel, Yahweh, to demonstrate who he is and all his power to show up and save his people and bring them out of slavery and to execute judgment against his enemies, and also a God of forgiveness and faithfulness even when his own people commit treachery against him. There's an opportunity for forgiveness and passion when it comes to Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so the incentive, the reward for reading the book of Exodus is a close encounter through the Holy Spirit with our God, the God of salvation and the God of judgment. That's a quick overview of the book of Exodus, our week 5. Next week, we're going to be looking at the next book, the book of Leviticus. Your homework is on the back of your sheet. Thanks for watching this week, and I hope to see you soon.